We can.
All right, everybody, welcome to CFPE's seminar. I am stepping in for Rachel Heath. A bit last minute, so if I make any mistake, just correct me and let me know. I'm Steve Goodrow. I'm the Development Core Director here at CSPE. We have a panel today with Isabel Cohen and Emma Riley on it. We originally had a third panelist, RJ Restar, who's unable to make it due to illness. I just want to say before introducing each of them that I got to know both of these wonderful researchers last summer in the grant writing summer program that CSDE runs that I facilitate all summer. And so a shameless plug for that, because today is officially the deadline for submitting applications for that. Although if you read my last email on that topic closely enough, you would notice that I said that it's okay to get them in by Sunday, because there's no way in heck I'm going to spend this weekend reviewing applications. So by Sunday is fine. And all it is some specific aims and a bio sketch. This is for all of the faculty or affiliates and postdoc affiliates who are listening or in the room. Specific aims and a bio sketch. And the specific aims need to be reasonably developed, but not ready to submit to NIH or anything like that. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to be taking the workshop in the first place. So hope to see lots of you applying. With that, with my shameless way of using both of your experiences for my own ends, but I'll return to you. So today we're going to have Emma speaking first. Emma joined us a few years ago after her PhD in economics at Oxford. Is now an assistant professor in economics here, but will be leaving us for the University of Michigan next year, which I have to, admit is a wonderful opportunity for Emma. A great economics program. They're world famous. We're not thrilled, but we're very happy for Emma. Emma works in development economics, as do they both, focusing in sub-Saharan Africa. Does work with large-scale field experiments and with a focus on women's empowerment and topics around mobile money, mobile banking services, anti-poverty programs such as cash transfers, graduation programs, and that's her general domain. And then Isabel, who is also an assistant professor, this time in the Evans School of Public Policy, also has a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. Worked for a while at the Center for Microfinance in Tamil Nadu, which in Chennai, India. Before that PhD, also works in some similar spaces around girls and women's empowerment, microfinance, education, health services, but given the Evans School affiliation, with a particular focus on implementation in government and non-governmental services, focus on large-scale randomized controlled trials, and they've worked in Uganda, India, Peru, Greece, and now Nigeria. Is that right? And I didn't have your profile didn't have a similar list, but I know some that you've worked in. So what we're going to do today is Emma's going to, because we don't have RJ, it was originally 10 minutes each. They can expand out to 12 to 15 minutes if they want to, or keep it as it is. Emma will speak first, then Isabel, and then I'll see if they have any responses for each other or any points of conversation they want to engage in, and then we'll do all of our Q&A and so on. For those who are online, please remember if you have a Q&A or if you have a Q that you want an A for, please put that in the Q&A, not in the chat. Okay? And are you gonna? Who's monitoring the Q&A?
I'm monitoring the Q&A online, and I'll change slides when it's time.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Oh, you'll okay. But do they have direct control over changing their individual slides? Yes. Okay. And I think, as usual, big picture questions. For the end, short clarifying questions in the meanwhile. And with that, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dee, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be presenting to you today, and I also do highly recommend the grant writing course, so definitely sign up for that if you're interested. But I'm really excited to be presenting to you today a paper looking at the impact of cash transfers and role models for women's empowerment in rural Kenya. I presented this paper to economists and to psychologists, but I'm really interested in getting a kind of more diverse range of opinions and insights from you all. And just to mention that this is joint work with Maureen Mahmood at the University of Exeter and Kate Orkin at the University of Oxford. So gender inequalities are large and pervasive worldwide, and in particular, women still do not have equal access and ownership of assets and economic resources that they need to generate income. In addition, women's experience of domestic violence is extremely high worldwide, with the World Health Organization estimating that 1 in 30 women have ever experienced an incident of physical or sexual intimate partner violence. And gender equality is not only important kind of in and of itself, but there's also strong evidence that empowering women matters for economic development as well, with more empowered women better able to contribute to the economy and to income growth of their nation. And partly why gender equality is such a complex issue is because it is multidimensional. So there are a large range of different kinds of factors that contribute to women's low empowerment. And these include economic factors, but also social and psychological factors. So in this study, we're going to be trying to focus in on 2 types of factor, economic and psychological. And we're using a village clustered randomized control trial in rural Kenya to look at the impact of a large unconditional cash transfer. So that's alleviating economic constraints, and a role model intervention, which is targeted at psychological constraints on their own and in combination on women's empowerment and experience of domestic violence after 1 year. And so just to give you an insight into the study design, this is a 2-by-2 design where villagers are being randomly assigned to either get a cash transfer or not to get any cash transfer, or to have households within the village get a role model video or to get an information video, which just contains sort of the information content of the role model video without actually including the role model. So in this study, we have about 44 villagers assigned to each of these 4 study arms. And then we're going to be describing these arms as basically the cash transfer arm. This is villages where people got the cash transfer and the information video. The placebo arm are villages where people did not get a cash transfer. They still got this information video. The role model villages are villages where women receive this role model video, but no cash transfer. And then I'll call the combined study arm is places where women got these role model videos and also households received this cash transfer. So where is this study taking place? Our sample is 176 villages in rural areas of Kenya. So this is from Siaya County, a western region in Kenya. So this is this blue dot in the left-hand picture, sort of showing where Siaya is in western Kenya. And then on the right-hand image, you can see with the different sort of dots and stars, all of the villages included in the study, all 176, along with their treatment assignment, either sort of cash or the role model video or control communities. And our sample within these villages is 3,000 married women. We restricted this to married women aged 59 or less at baseline to be sort of aligned with the World Health Organization. And to know a bit about them, they're on average just over 30 years old, have been married for 14 years. They have 11 years of schooling and they have just under 4 children on average. So this is our study sample. The context of this study is that IPV, or intimate partner violence, is extremely common and also extremely normalized. So by this, I mean that 61% of women in the study placebo group reported that their partner had committed an act of physical violence against them in the last 12 months. So very, very high rates of violence compared to the world average, which is more like a third. In addition, violence is very normalized. So 50% of both men and women are reporting that a husband is justified in hitting or beating his wife for one of 5 various reasons, which include things as mundane as sort of burning the food. In addition, though, women have some degree of economic empowerment. So women own on average 21% of the value of non-land household assets. This is primarily things like poultry and small household durable goods. And there aren't restrictions on the movement of women outside the household in the way there might be in somewhere like India. So a little bit more detail about the intervention. So I said that households in this study are receiving a large cash transfer. So this cash transfer is just over $2,000 at purchasing power parity prices. If you wanted to put that into sort of regular US dollars, you'd roughly halve it. So it's about 1,000 like nominal US dollars. And this is given out through mobile money services in 3 tranches, each 2 months apart. Generally, the transfer went to the woman. So in 80% of households, this cash transfer is being given directly to the woman in the household. Theoretically, the link between providing a cash transfer and women's empowerment is actually ambiguous. Women's bargaining power might improve if they retain control over the cash transfer and can use it to generate their own income. Additionally, violence might decrease in households if violence is stress-related and you've alleviated poverty-related stress. But on the other hand, men may use violence to try and extract the cash transfer from their wives or due to status threat if their wives are participating more economically. So theoretically, the link is ambiguous. Most studies prior studies of cash transfers have found either null effects or positive impacts of cash transfers on domestic violence. So that's sort of the prior you might want to take into looking at these results. Second intervention is then this role model intervention. This consists of a video featuring 2 female role models who are seen setting goals, overcoming challenges, and generally improving their lives, improving their economic condition in consultation with their spouse. So you should think of this as like a positive intervention, sort of showing an idealized situation where spouses might be supporting their wives in sort of achieving household economic goals. I should point out that the role model videos are not explicitly about domestic violence. They're not explicitly about women's empowerment, apart from through showing an example of economically empowered women. And they're not designed to be changing social norms. So you should think of the video more as like demonstrating a sort of maybe a model of what cooperation in the household could really look like. And here are some clips from the videos, including like English subtitles. So you can see that the woman in the left-hand picture is sort of describing how they can make a plan together, and that plan would enable them to buy their own plot of land. And in the right-hand side, you sort of see the end story in the second video. The woman's been able to open a tailoring business and improve her economic situation as a result. And the quote is really demonstrating that the videos are about the husband and wife cooperating together in order to improve their economic situation. So I'm going to be showing you 2 main types of measures. So the first ones are capturing women's economic empowerment. And we use the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture questionnaire to capture ownership of assets. And we're going to be looking at the proportion of household assets which the woman reports as being owned solely by herself or jointly with another household member. And then secondly, we're going to be looking at an indicator for women's ownership of small enterprises. So if the woman describes herself as owning and running a small business. For intimate partner violence, we use the demographic and health survey measures to measure different domains of domestic violence, both physical and sexual. We actually did this using ACASI or audio computer assisted interviewing techniques for increased privacy over these sensitive questions. And we then combine these different physical and sexual violence measures together into an IPV index. So I'm just going to summarize the main results for time reasons. So we see that women who were randomly assigned to the combined intervention, so who received both the cash transfer and the role model video, report owning a greater share of household assets. We also see that women, both in the cash transfer arm on its own and in the combined intervention of the cash transfer and the role model, see higher rates of enterprise ownership. Interestingly, only the combined intervention group also report having a greater say in decision-making about both inputs and the income of these non-farm enterprises. In terms of IPV, we do not see a significant change in domestic violence from any of the treatments, so none of them are causing a reduction in IPV, though we do see an indication that violence is lower in the combined intervention group compared to the cash-only group. So 11.11 standard deviations lower in the combined intervention. So generally, the takeaway from this is that the combined intervention is increasing women's control over economic assets in the household, and also potentially leading to a reduction in domestic violence, at least compared to women who receive a cash transfer alone. I don't actually know, my time has gone up. I'm good, okay. In terms of the mechanisms, we looked at a number of different mechanisms around decision-making, women's well-being, different types of emotional IPV as well. And what we see again is that the combined intervention leads to improvements in women's decision-making, it leads to improvements in the respondents' well-being, and it leads to improvements in the respondents' perceptions of the quality of her relationship with her spouse, mainly driven by a reduction in arguments with her spouse. We don't see any changes from any of these treatment arms in attitudes towards violence in the village. We also look at heterogeneity in these results, and we did this by classifying women at baseline as either at low, medium, or high risk of experiencing domestic violence, using a wide range of both household and individual characteristics. What we actually see is that there are a group of women who at baseline were at high risk of experiencing IPV, for whom getting a cash transfer actually worsens their experience of domestic violence. When you combine that cash transfer with the role model intervention, that seems to mitigate this increase in violence, such that women in the high-risk group no longer experience an increase in violence when they receive a cash transfer. It doesn't go down, but they don't experience an increase like they do when they receive a cash transfer alone. We also see amongst low risk violence households that violence decreases even further when they get the combined intervention. So again, this is evidence of something synergistic about getting the role model intervention with the cash transfer, such that women's empowerment and outcomes are improving, or at least preventing a subgroup experience of worsening of violence. So I'm just going to conclude there on time. So we show that women's control of household resources improve when they get a cash transfer in combination with a role model intervention. We also see improvements in decision-making and improvements in relationship quality in these households. The interventions on their own have a limited or no impact. We do not see on average any changes in domestic violence from any of the interventions, but we see violence being lower in the combined intervention compared to getting the cash transfer on its own. And we have suggested evidence that there is large heterogeneity in the impacts of the cash transfer in terms of women's experience of domestic violence, and that the combined intervention might be helping to mitigate an otherwise increase in violence for some vulnerable subgroups. So thank you very much.
Oh, can you press the escape button? I might need you to also, there we go. That's what I was looking for. Okay. Anyway.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to CSDE for inviting me to join this panel today, and for the NIH workshop last summer, which I also highly recommend. I'm here today to talk a little bit about the research project Pathways to Choice. And this is joint work with Mariam Abubakar and Daniel Perlman at Ahmadu Bello University and at the Oasis Initiative. So the context of this talk is really, Emma gave us a great introduction and some really helpful background on women's empowerment more generally. I'm going to focus in on a pretty narrow dimension, we'll say, of empowerment, which is specifically the problem of child marriage. In this figure, it's just kind of a very simple description of the percent of women in a given country married before the legal minimum age in that country. One thing that I want you to take away from this graph and this figure is just that these rates are pretty high in a number of different countries worldwide. Nigeria is where we're going to be focusing in on during today's talk, but it's by far, by a large measure, not the only country where child marriage is a persistent, substantial problem. In Nigeria, the minimum age of marriage is 18. As you can see from this darkened figure, the data here suggests that 50 to 100% of women across Nigeria are married before the age of 18. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the specific region where we do our study. It would be pretty easy to fill more than 15 minutes talking about the negative effects of child marriage. I won't do full justice to that literature. It's a difficult problem to study, in part because many of the things that put girls at risk for child marriage, poverty, low education, also actually are worsened by child marriage. But the evidence that we do have suggests that child marriage has extremely negative effects on women's educational attainment, labor force participation, physical health, due to the direct, most women who are married as children also start to have their own children much younger, which can have extremely harmful physical consequences. And there's actually evidence showing intergenerational effects of child marriage, where the children born from those marriages have worse health and education outcomes than they do when women are married at older ages. So hopefully, it didn't take too much convincing, but hopefully I've convinced you that this is a serious problem that we should be concerned about. In northern Nigeria, so this study took place in 3 different states in northern Nigeria: Borno, Kaduna, and Kano, northwest and northeast of Nigeria. In this region, about 80% of girls are married before the age of 18, but 50% are married before the age of 15. So Nigeria, it's similar to some of its neighbors in this sense, but the problem of child marriage, legally defined, is actually worse in Nigeria than many other countries because of the extremely young ages at which such a high share of these girls are married. One thing that this means is that child marriage is not just something that takes place in northern Nigeria, right? It's what I would call a normative behavior. It's not just the occasional girl who's getting married at a very young age, but as a girl is growing up, she's watching other girls get married at the ages of 13, 14, 15. She may perceive girls who are getting married at 16, 17, 18 as old when they get married, right? And she knows that her peers will also be getting married at these young ages as well. So one challenge with this kind of setting is that if someone individually says, I really want to not get married at 14, I really want to wait till I'm 16 or I'm 18, she and her parents might be very concerned about what that will do to her ability to make a good marriage. I think about this here as concerning social signals. When you go against something that's the norm in a community, there can be social penalties for that behavior. So this is a tricky context in which to try to work to delay child marriage. There's a couple other pieces of helpful context that I just want to provide. One thing to know about northern Nigeria in particular is that the educational system is extremely lacking. There's this RTI international report suggesting that about 6% of students could read a sentence by the end of grade 3. Qualitative interviews done in the context of this project with parents suggest that parents are pretty realistic about the quality of education available to them. And in fact, in practice, that they sort of think it's worse. So parents will say things like, I sent my first daughter to school, she didn't learn a thing, I'm not going to bother sending my second daughter. It's dangerous to travel. It's time that the girl can otherwise spend taking care of siblings or helping with farm agriculture or other household chores. And so when parents see no benefit from sending their children to school, they strategically choose not to do so. And this sort of information is borne out in a lot of other surveys in Nigeria as well. about 50% of girls in the most recent DHS who had actually attended primary school were still unable to read an entire sentence. So you should think of this as a context, not just in which education is poor, but in which the main alternative to marriage and staying in school is not meaningfully available. So what are we going to evaluate in this setting? The Pathways to Choice program is run by the Center for Girls' Education in Abuja, Nigeria. This is an organization run, managed, designed, and set up by women from the regions they serve. So most of these women faced themselves the same pressure that the girls they worked with faced during childhood. And what they've designed over the last decade or so is a program to intensively recruit and work with unmarried out-of-school girls in practice aged about 11 to 17, who receive weekly meetings of about 2 hours in duration with a trained supported mentor. These mentors are generally girls from similar communities, not the girls' own communities, but at this point in CGE's trajectory, most of them went themselves through the program and are now working as mentors. In the context of this, they receive very intensive remedial education. So for many of them, it's literacy and numeracy skills, as well as sort of financial literacy, social, designed conversations to improve social support in the first year. In the second year, CGE supports them in either returning to government schools, so re-enrolling, as all of these girls are out of school at baseline, or enrolling in vocational training. In either case, CGE will pay the institution, not the girl, to make sure that there's no sort of costs or fees, at least for that second year of the program. So we evaluate this in the context of a cluster randomized control trial over a 2-year period. There were 18 pair randomized communities in the study across these 3 different states, about 1,200 girls, average age of about 13 and a half at baseline. Happy to talk more about some of the other statistics in this setting that we learned about these girls at baseline, but for the purposes of statistical validity, I'll just note that the 2 sets, the treatment and control group villages, were reasonably balanced at baseline, meaning the sets of girls look pretty similar. So what we find is that the Pathways program has pretty substantial effects on child marriage. In this figure, I'm showing you the percent of girls reported to us that they were not married at the baseline. In both treatment and control communities, it was pretty high, about 90%. Those 10% that were married were mostly still living at home, but may have been, legally or nearly wed. At baseline, so 90% unmarried at baseline. At endline in the control villages, that share drops to less than 20%. So the vast majority of girls in the control group get married in that 2-year period, remembering that they were 13 and a half at baseline, in that 2-year period from 13 and a half to 15 and a half. What's interesting is that that doesn't take place in the Pathways community. Although there's a small share of girls that do get married, the Pathways program results in about a 60 percentage point decrease in the share of girls who marry between baseline and endline. So there's a substantial delay in the time, the timing between for which that marriage takes place. So this is a really big effect. I can contextualize this a little bit more by just letting you know that relative to other similar interventions that have been tried, this effect is about 10 times the magnitude of most what are called safe spaces programs. There have been other successful programs in other contexts. There are contextual differences which matter in thinking about these things. But by essentially any metric, this program produces results essentially an order of magnitude larger than most comparable programs. The challenge for us is to try to think about why. There's 3 sort of different pathways that I'm going to outline for you. And in practice, because we sort of did pathways or not, it's difficult to untangle these. And to be honest, I'm not sure they are untangleable. I think fundamentally, this is a bundled program where the different components come together to, combine with one another and produce the effect of them. Nonetheless, it's useful to sort of break down some of these different potential pathways and see what we know about them. One big thing that Pathways does is it dramatically increases the share of girls attending school. It leads to about a 690% increase, about roughly a 69 percentage point increase in the share of girls attending school in treatment villages. There's a couple different reasons we think this might happen. The remedial education that girls are provided in the safe spaces likely increases the value of schooling to them by giving them some knowledge base, some basic literacy and numeracy that will actually allow them to learn further in school. The direct school fees support provided by Pathways significantly decreases the cost to parents of sending their girls to school. It also covers things, both small formal fees and informal fees like needing to purchase uniforms and books and other things which can be expensive for households. That said, I don't have the results in this slide, but mediation analysis suggests that the school attendance itself only explains about 30 to 40% of the total Pathways effect. So it doesn't seem like it's really as simple in this context as just getting a girl herself in school. That leads us to one of the other things that Pathways really does. When Pathways works in a community, one of the main goals by the Center for Girls Education is that they recruit nearly 100% of eligible girls. They do this through kind of a long, sustained engagement where they work very closely with village leaders to talk to them about the program. They're very careful, deliberate, and strategic in introducing this program to the local context where they work and in building the trust of the local communities so that as outsiders or relative outsiders, they can still come in and deliver their programming. This is particularly important because of how normative this behavior is in this context. I would argue that the whole community engagement that Pathways undertakes essentially reduces any potential social penalty for late marriage or school attendance or other behaviors that in this context are a little bit unusual. There's a couple of pieces of data on this that we can think about. One, there's two different sort of tests I've done looking at community level variations to try to support or work for or against this hypothesis. One thing we find is that Pathways is less effective when a girl's peers are older at baseline. So conditional on a girl's own age, if the other girls in her group are a year older, the effect of Pathways is cut by about half. So the age of her cohort at baseline significantly affects the effectiveness of a girl for Pathways. Additionally, there's also evidence that Pathways is more effective when a girl's sisters are also enrolled in the program with her. These are mostly polygamous communities in which there's a bit of variation in how many sisters a girl has and sort of how similar their ages are. The greater a share of a girl's sisters that are enrolled, the more effective the Pathways program is at delaying marriage. So there's significant support in the data itself for sort of these community aspects of the program and how things, come together for the community, mattering a lot for the direct effect on delays in marriage. There's other factors as well. There's meaningful evidence that Pathways increases self-perception, self-reported social support, so the number of people in the village the girl feels she can rely on, and self-advocacy, how likely the girl is to speak up to her parents about wanting to stay in school or wanting not to get married. And we look here at both sort of direct speaking herself or indirect methods where she might recruit other people to speak on her behalf. But by pretty much all of these measures, her willingness to speak up for herself increases. Now, it's not necessarily clear how to differentiate between these different pathways, other than to sort of say it seems very likely that they all come together to create the substantial effect that I showed you in the previous slide. There's another thing that I think is helpful to note about Pathways. Because it's a bundled program, because it's very intensive in its implementation and doing a number of different things, and additionally providing direct financial support for school enrollment and so on, it has a pretty high upfront cost of implementation. Compared to other programs, it is substantially more expensive. However, since it works so well, it actually has a fairly comparable net present value based on benefit cost analysis to a number of other comparable programs, and is actually much more effective than many other comparable programs in terms of cost effectiveness ratios, like the years unmarried per $1,000 invested. So taking these results from Pathways, we basically find that for every $1,000, about 2 years of marriage are, there's a delay in 2 years of marriage across girls. So just to wrap up, we find in this short-term study that Pathways to Choice delays marriage, probably primarily by increasing education, but with significant evidence that the whole community engagement and increases in self-advocacy likely play an important role. And one thing in particular that I think comes out of this study and that hopefully merits further research as well is that, and I think is borne out in Emma's work too, when we bundle different interventions together, we can often get more than doing them individually. So thank you all so much for your attention. And I'm 18 seconds over, but I'll be there.
Thank you both so much. This is so interesting and exciting and heartening. And you took exactly 30 minutes between the two of you, which is the sum total of the 3 you were originally allocated, so that's perfect. I'll open up for questions in a second, but I want to start with one sort of for both of you, and maybe the conversation around, you know, I think something else that arises in the world I work in HIV prevention and probably many other similar fields, right? Which is find things that work. You want to, right? There's the struggle between, okay, let's go out and now implement it. And like this works. Let's just do it. And then, but will it be, will it be scalable? Will it be reproducible? We want to understand all the causal. On the one hand, it's like it doesn't matter why it worked. It works. Let's get out there. On the other hand, those causal pathways may determine how well it works in other settings, and just kind of where do you see your work and where do you fit in with all that? What do you think is the future for these specific interventions and in general, like that whole struggle? I think as academics working with people on the ground, but not being on the ground ourselves, sort of where that all, how that plays out. I know, yeah.
I can start. So I guess cash transfer programs. So the cash transfer that I was studying is provided by an NGO called Give Directly, who've really been rolling out their cash transfers very rapidly across sub-Saharan Africa. So in terms of the cash transfer implementation, that is being done in many different countries, and there's many different studies of the impacts of the cash transfers in different contexts. I think what's more interesting about our study is that prior work has also hinted that there may be some groups for whom cash transfers can potentially increase domestic violence, and we hinted a solution is to find a way to economically empower women at the same time as you give out these cash transfers. And so there, I think these videos, they could be relatively scalable in the sense that obviously having an enumerator like show a video at the same time that they're enrolling people into a cash transfer program is something quite easy and scalable. I think the main challenge will be how tailored do the videos need to be to each community or each country specifically, and that's really going to determine the scalability.
Yeah, I mean, that question of tailoring is exactly, I think, where I would also start with the pathways intervention. What's interesting about this intervention in particular is that so many other empowerment programs do not work or work only a little bit, work, in 3, 5, 6 percentage point magnitude. And, the main set of empowerment sort of safe spaces programs with some similar dimensions to this one that have been implemented are like the ELA program by BRAC, which has, youth clubs and sort of provides education and social support and is meant to kind of produce the similar outcomes to this. That had an effect of about 6 percentage points in Uganda, but didn't seem to have meaningful effects in Tanzania or Sierra Leone. And a very similar program by another organization didn't have any meaningful effects in Bangladesh. So to some extent, I would be very hesitant to sort of say, oh yes, everyone, there's a lot of other benefits to these programs that I think exist, but if we're viewing them as a solution for child marriage, I would be very, very hesitant to say, yes, let's just put all girls into safe spaces. I think part of the reason that Pathways works so well is that it really is locally tailored. It's not sort of developed by a big international organization that just dropped it into a local setting with no context. The specifics of what they do and how they do it were designed by women from these actual communities where it takes place. And so we would all love to find the silver bullet that fixes these huge, terrible worldwide problems. And I think, to me, the Pathways program is encouraging because it suggests that done right, empowerment programs can have these big effects. But I don't think it's necessarily, like Emma was saying, I think you'd have to figure out what level of local tailoring is involved. What do you need to know about the context to decide whether or not it would work there? There's a lot more I could say about this context, and sort of some particular features I think make it particularly impactful. But yeah, it's an important question, but it's a challenging question. And I think both of these projects, there's a lot more learning to do there.
Thanks. All right, we will open for questions from either the audience in the room or on the chat. Not the chat, the Q&A. I don't see anyone in the room.
I have a question for each. For Emma, I was wondering about the value of having like the two interventions sort of like done separately instead of, I know that some cash transfer programs in some countries, like the cash transfer happens like together with a training on like health or like something like that. And so if you could speak to the benefits or not benefits of having like two separate ones. And for Isabel, I'll remember. Yeah.
So on your question, I think there's a lot of
Can you just repeat it for people online?
so the question well, it was about sort of the adding additional elements to cash transfer programs. So other programs have things like health elements, for example, and so can I talk about the benefits of here adding a role model to a cash transfer? I think it's true that there's a lot of interest now worldwide about this type of cash transfer, which I say is like a large one-off cash transfer, as opposed to a like conditional small cash transfers, which are more like monthly small payments. So in terms of like large one-off cash transfers now, there's a lot of interest in like what could be combined with that cash transfer to maybe make it more impactful. I think there's a lot of like new understanding is coming out that, you know, if you just kind of drop this huge amount, like thousands of dollars on people without kind of other elements, it might almost be that households are unprepared for how to deal with receiving so much cash at once. And so combining this with sort of other trainings, other elements of like women's empowerment in this case, some programs have also looked at things like cognitive behavioral therapy and sort of like goal setting and mental health interventions as well. But I think there's going to be a lot of research in the near future kind of showing that you might not just want to like dump a whole load of cash on people, but, you know, combining it with some other program, if it can be done in a low cost and scalable way, is very beneficial.
Yes, I remembered. Yeah, it's just like I was very interested in sort of like the pathway of like affecting social norms, or at least preventing sort of like that stigma, like all of that. And so wondering if you would see effects like after the 2 years are done, like potentially those effects sort of like reverberate or whatever that word, like for years, right? And so do you think you would be able to see that, or have you seen that in villages where that ended, but maybe you see a little bit of a change still happening?
Yeah, well, as Steve knows, that's what I'm applying to NIH to get funding to do. So if they fund me, I'll come back and answer this question. Yeah. So I will say, I think it's very much an open question. I think clearly the success of Pathways, like Pathways can't do anything if the parents of the girls don't buy in to this, right? The girls don't have enough agency in this context of Northern Nigeria to just make these decisions on their own. So it's kind of clear by, you know, virtue of the results being what they are, that parents thought this was, you know, all right to go with it. It's not immediately clear to me. Like, I would love to say I'm 100% confident that I'm going to hopefully go back and survey these girls again. And I would love to say it's going to be really, really clear that their lives are better than the control group. They'll just, they'll be doing what they want to be doing. They won't have gotten married as children and had a number of children at an age when their bodies weren't really ready for it. But it's also possible that like parents are wrong about how like potential social penalties for, you know, delaying marriage. And so I think it's a really, my hope is that it does reverberate, and there are sort of like, we'll be able to go back and say that it was ultimately beneficial and like sort of an increasing effect. And I think in the end, if we essentially discover that they didn't get married for 2 years, and then when the program ended, they immediately got married, I would probably consider that a success, because at least they're engaging in childbearing starting from 15 or 16 and not 12 or 13. So it's a good question. I hope to answer it empirically, because I'm not sure how to answer it theoretically, if that makes sense.
That's in the room. Yes. Yeah.
So I was just interested in how, given that you're operating, and Emma, you kind of had all these villages that were kind of in close proximity. to each other. Given the nature of this intervention, how does contamination kind of play a role, or how do you kind of have confidence? How do you go about kind of having confidence that it isn't having kind of an effect? And then Isabel, I just actually, maybe for you, I wondered kind of, I know Kaduna State stands out in Nigeria compared to other provinces, and so I wondered kind of how you thought about the portability of this to other places or relevance. You mentioned a polygamous culture in at least parts of that region, and so just think about these places in their context a little bit.
Great. So to answer your question about contamination, yeah, that is a hugely important point. I think when initial cash transfer studies were done, they were often done like within villages, and then there'd be huge potential for contamination then. So firstly, we approach this by having a village level design. So the entire village is going to be getting the intervention or not. And we also spent a lot of time like mapping out these villages and thinking about how separate they were from each other. I was involved in activities where we like walked around the villages in order to like map them out, because there weren't like otherwise maps kind of showing the boundaries of the village. And we did that so that we could make sure the villages were sufficiently far enough from each other, so that there wasn't like a border where households were flexible about which village they were in, and we could ensure there was sufficient separation. At the same time, this is so we did as much as we could then to avoid contamination, but this is quite a high population density area of Kenya, and so it's certainly possible that there would be some element of contamination across villages. And now further studies on cash transfers have actually shown that you might even need to give cash transfers at sort of like county or like parish levels if you want to actually ensure that there's no contamination at all.
Yeah, so the pathway study, this study in particular, a lot of my work is in Kaduna State, but this study actually took place in Kaduna, Kano, and Borno. So 3 different states, 2 of which are in northwest Nigeria, and 1 of which is in northeast Nigeria. So most of northern Nigeria is polygamous, Muslim, and Hausa in terms of ethnic group. It's difficult and not necessarily straightforward to say how much those particular contexts affect the results of the experiment. Northern Nigeria is not dissimilar to Niger, and in the northern parts of other countries like Ghana, for example, have some relatively similar cultural features, others that are different. So, it doesn't strike me as something that like only would work in Kaduna, even as implemented. It strikes me as something that, with local adjustments could work in a number of relatively similar settings, but I wouldn't take it, for example, to Uganda, because in Uganda, although there is child marriage, it's actually early entry into childbearing and sexual debut that's more of a problem than child marriage. So they're really very different settings. But I don't think it's like Kaduna only, for example.
I was thinking about the sustainability of like funding and implementation of these programs. And then I was wondering like if there were any like willingness or the pushback from the government or the communities about this like initiatives or the programs. Because I understand like these kind of situations happening was like all historical and then happened for a long time. So I don't know if there were any like discussions or like any findings that you guys.
Yeah, so 2 questions, one about funding and sort of government buy-in, and then one about community buy-in. Yeah. So in terms of funding, the Center for Girls Education, why one question you might ask is, why did the Center for Girls Education spend a lot of money doing this impact evaluation? They had a strong belief in the efficacy of their program. That's actually true of a lot of organizations. It was great. I believed in it as well, and it's great that it worked out. As a researcher, I'm of course agnostic about the possibility of success or failure in doing the evaluation, but as a human being, it's really nice that this had an effect. I think, in general, the government of Kaduna in particular, which is very unusual within Nigeria, has been very interested in this. The Center for Girls Education has a number of advocacy programs they run with the government. They bring policymakers to the safe spaces and allow them to see the work for themselves. I do think in general, there's a really, really high potential for sort of community distrust or backlash against safe spaces programs more broadly. I talked about sort of the careful introduction as contributing to this sort of whole community aspect of the mechanisms. But I also think it is entirely possible for a community to basically say, get out of here, we don't want you. And that part of the reason that pathways can work in these places is just the slow, careful introduction of these topics. I've had some really, really interesting conversations with the Center for Girls Education. We have another ongoing study working with married adolescents. And we sort of said, okay, great. We really want to know at baseline, are they using contraception? And CGE said, oh, we can't ask that. If we go in and we start talking about contraception, they'll never let us work in these villages. And I'm like, but you're going there to get them to use contraception. They're like, yeah, we can't lead with that. We can't just jump into condoms. They're like, okay. So, they're very, very, very strategic and thoughtful in how they make this approach. And I think that's part of what makes it successful, maybe part of what also makes it hard to scale up effectively. But it is a really important part of the work that they do.
And I think in terms of the cash transfer program, there was actually some really interesting things going on in terms of acceptance of cash transfers in rural Kenya when we did this study. So Give Directly, the NGO that gave out the cash transfers, worked really closely with the government and with the district government to sensitize communities. But actually, sometimes we would encounter a situation in communities where local political leaders would kind of see the idea of community members getting cash transfers as potentially undermining their own influence in those communities. And we would actually have local leaders sort of start rumors about these cash transfers, say you were like taking money from the devil, for example, was like a very, very common one. And in some communities, these rumors became such a problem that Give Directly then wasn't able to go in and offer the cash transfers at all because of this. So I think it's a really, really important dimension with cash transfers to get sort of local government buy-in, but also accept that economically empowering the population might not necessarily be in the interest of all the community leaders. And so finding ways to kind of manage that so they can't undermine the program might be really important as well.
So Isabel, I think you mentioned a little bit about a qualitative element to your study. And so I'm curious if both of you could speak about kind of how that way of knowing just like generally can complement this type of RCT work.
Yeah, so I was very lucky in my setting because I'm not trained as a qualitative researcher and I can't really do that work myself. But Daniel Perlman, who was also involved in this study, is a qualitative researcher, and he's actually worked with CGE for many years. And so a number of the women at CGE are also trained in qualitative research methods, which is really wonderful. So that's actually a really important part of their program development is while they're doing the programs, independent of the research side, they do a lot of sort of qualitative research on their own participants and mentors in order to kind of improve and refine the services they're offering. For this case, we have they did a lot of interviews and sort of focus groups, and they some of that work is actually published in other papers, sort of the qualitative component of the impact evaluation essentially, and results from other, sort of deep qualitative engagements that they've done in these settings. I think it's kind of essential with a program like this where we're sort of trying to look at and think about these really big impacts, or really any program where you want to have this kind of deeper understanding of the results. I think qualitative work can play an incredibly important and valuable role in just making sense of what has actually happened and can guide you in sort of doing the quantitative work. That's not to say that the quantitative work should be the ultimate outcome, but as an economist who does quantitative work, I'm very grateful for the existence of the qualitative work to help me figure out where to look in my own research. And I would say I feel very fortunate in this case to have access to that as a resource. And I generally wish it was taken a little bit more seriously in economics as a whole.
No, I agree. I think that qualitative work is extremely important. And unfortunately, we didn't do any, we didn't have anyone with the expertise to do it in this project. But I can say in my subsequent work, I am partnering with people who do qualitative work. So I am excited to add that component to my own research. I think, like you say, economists are not really trained to do qualitative work.
Time for one more, maybe if there's any. Anyone on the call? I mean, on the webinar? Last chance. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, both of you, for all such vital work. And, yeah, thanks. This is more for you, but have you ever heard of the Infinite Giving Foundation? You're one of many